morning, Trinity family. This is Pastor Jeff here. Yes, I'm still inside because it's still cold outside, but happy Holy Saturday to you. I've got a burning question that's been in my head for a lot of years. What are we supposed to do on Holy Saturday anyway? What do we do between Good Friday and Easter? I don't know. What do you normally do around your house? Maybe you're kind of plotting out where you're going to hide your Easter eggs for all the fun tomorrow morning. Maybe you spend a lot of time in the kitchen preparing a feast. Maybe you're cleaning up the house, preparing for company, at least in other years, not this year. But I kind of think of it a little bit more religiously too. Like, what are we as Christians supposed to be thinking and feeling and all of that on the Saturday? We know on Friday we're pretty somber, and on Sunday it's a big celebration, but what do we do in between? Should we be sad? Should we be joyful and happy? Should we be kind of like holding vigil, as it were, and just kind of waiting? Honestly, I don't know. And I've never really heard anyone tell me a coherent answer as to what we should be doing. But the passage that we're going to look at today tells us a lot about what Christ was doing, at least a little bit of what Christ was doing in between his crucifixion and his resurrection. And so let's focus on him a little bit as we do that. Most of this past week you've been listening to various devotionals from the Gospel of Matthew. But today's devotional comes out of a smaller New Testament book called 1 Peter. In fact, if you want to read the whole kind of chapter or passage that I'm looking at today, it's chapter 3 verse 8 all the way to chapter 4 verse 6. But I'm going to focus especially on 1 Peter 3 verses 18 through 20. 18 I think is pretty straightforward, and it speaks a lot to what Christ accomplished on the cross. But let's just hear it again. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. Let's walk through that phrase by phrase. For Christ also suffered once for sins. This tells us that his suffering was complete. He didn't have to do it again and again. His sacrifice was enough. It was totally sufficient. The next phrase tells us Christ suffered as the righteous for the unrighteous. In other words, he didn't have to do this, but he voluntarily was our substitute. He was the righteous one, and he swapped himself in the place of us who are unrighteous. The next phrase tells us he did this to bring us to God, which tells us that his suffering ultimately was about reconciliation, reconciling us in our relationship with God. Well, so far, that's pretty simple. Well, I shouldn't say simple. It's amazing stuff, but it's straightforward. It's when we get into verses 19 and 20 that things get a little bit different. And again, as a review, this is really talking about Christ, what Christ was doing on the Saturday. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. Now you might first listen to that and think, huh? That's like one of those passages you tend to skip over, and then you look for something a little more devotional. Well, let's again maybe go through it a little bit phrase by phrase. So after being made alive, he went and made proclamation. Probably just as good of a way to translate that would be that he announced victory. To who? To the imprisoned spirits. Well, who are they? Well, I can tell you what they're not. They're probably not humans who have died and not gone to heaven or other things like that. This is tapping into a little bit of a thread that's all throughout Scripture. In fact, when we post this video, maybe I'll write down some of the references that come to mind here from Genesis and 2 Peter and also from Jude. These are likely rebellious spirits that rebelled against God a long time ago, as was talked about here in the days of Noah, who have been imprisoned by God. And it's them that Jesus goes and announces his victory to. I find this a little bit fascinating. I mean, we love, obviously, preaching about the resurrection and all that goes with it. And I think I've made a point before that, like, the first people to see the empty tomb in Scripture were women. Wonderful witnesses of Christ's resurrection in that regard. But all of that aside, actually the very first ones to hear about Christ's resurrection weren't humans at all. They were these imprisoned spirits, spiritual enemies of Christ, actually. And it's to them that he preaches his resurrection, his absolute victory over them. Might sound a little strange, a little out of the box to be thinking about it that way, but I find it actually quite comforting. You know, as we kind of joke about what we do or don't do on Holy Saturday and how we should feel or not feel, I mean, you can imagine what people were going through that very first Easter season and all the despair and the grief that they were going through. But while those people were weeping, Christ was at work. He was already preaching victory that was going to be made known to the physical world just a day later. There is something much bigger going on in Easter than just my salvation or yours. It's not less than that, but there's something much more cosmic going on. And so I invite you, with these things in our hearts and our minds, to tomorrow's Easter service when we gather online and worship the risen Lord together. And I would also just challenge you to invite someone to watch along with you. Someone, maybe a friend or coworker that you can invite to watch online. All right. Until then, we'll talk to you later.